The COVID-19 pandemic is leaving behind a trail of devastating consequences for our national economy. And it has plunged Australia into recession for the very first time in 30 years. The higher education sector has not been left unscathed and has been likened to being struck by a bolt of lightning and shaken to its core. The pandemic is almost certainly the biggest and the most unexpected disruptor ever experienced in our post-war history. This prompts the question, is COVID-19 the wake-up call for the higher education sector? Is the time opportune for a significant shift of paradigm to ensure the sustainability of some of Australia's oldest and most conservative universities, some of which have resisted change for so long? Or will they sadly continue to remain imprisoned within the ivory tower of academia and face eventual extinction? Will the glass be viewed as being half full or half empty? To answer the vexed question of what is the future for higher education in Australia, I'm in conversation today with the Vice Chancellor and President of La Trobe University, Victoria, Professor John Dewar, AO. Professor Dewar, welcome to Rotary Melbourne. We thank you for this opportunity. I must hasten to clarify that the questions that follow refer to the Australian education sector in general and are not specific to La Trobe University.
Yeah.
Please bear with me as some of the questions have been contextualized for the benefit of our members. We would welcome your personal views or indeed general views in your capacity as Deputy Chair of Universities Australia, member of the EXCO of the Australian Higher Education Industrial Association, and as Director of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China. We would also welcome comparisons based on your prior experience within the universities in the United Kingdom. So let's start off with the first question where I'd like to talk about the high risk profile and the potential vulnerability. In a recent ABC Four Corners report, international students were described as cash cows because in one case they contributed $500 million per annum towards total revenue. Victoria is host to 32% of total international student population. RMIT and Monash in particular have had very high numbers with international students making up 42.7 and 42.9 respectively of their total student numbers. Chinese students alone account for 50% of all international students enrolled in Australian universities. In an August 2019 study, the Centre of Independent Studies cautioned as follows, and I quote, "Chinese enrollments are particularly unstable, with universities being overexposed to political, competitive, and more importantly, macroeconomic risk factors in pursuit of the proverbial pot of gold." The study added that it is unconscionable that Australia's universities and their regulations hide behind the shield of government and neither define benchmarks nor make data available for any public debate on the potential risk of an over-reliance on Chinese students. Universities have also been accused of risking public funds and eroding public trust. The above allegations are of great concern and allude to a high risk profile and financial vulnerability due to a total lack of effective risk mitigation strategies. In 2019, the Federal Minister of Education, the Honorable Dan Tehan, too cautioned as follows, and I quote, "Over-reliance on a large number of students from any single country, such as China. The alarm bells have been sounding for some time. COVID-19 has only exacerbated this situation. In your synopsis, you claim that COVID-19 poses a fundamental threat to higher education in Australia. So my question is it fair to claim that COVID alone poses the fundamental threat, considering that these risk factors pre-exist? Have we put all our eggs in one basket? And if so, what are the potential risk mitigation strategies going forward? Thank you.
Wow, that's a big question, Suresh. So thank you, and forgive me if I take a little while to unpack its components.
Sure.
Now, the figures you quote are accurate. So some universities are as reliant as you indicate on international student revenue. That's certainly true. But I'd just like to take issue with a couple of statements you made there, which I think leave a false impression of what's happened. The first is that universities have been encouraged for many years, I'd say 3 decades at least, by successive governments to increase their proportion of international student enrolments. And in fact, all levels of government, state, federal, and various government departments, particularly foreign affairs and education, have encouraged universities to do this. Because it's had obvious benefits for Australia. It's brought some very talented young people to Australia. It's helped to fill many skills gaps in the economy when those young people graduate. It's brought significant financial benefits to the university system, but at the same time has enabled government to wind back its financial commitment to the university system because they've assumed that universities can fund things like infrastructure or subsidies for research from the revenue they generate from international students. So I don't think it's fair to say that universities have been on their own and acting recklessly in developing what has become Australia's 3rd most successful export market, let's not forget. And universities have worked collaboratively, as I say, with successive governments and many different government departments, to the extent that until the beginning of this year, whenever I went overseas, we were warmly embraced by Australia's ambassadors overseas on the basis that we did a brilliant job for the nation in building soft power relationships, in helping in so many different ways with maintaining good and warm, friendly relations with those countries. There is really no substitute for the warmth that a graduate of an Australian university feels towards Australia. And that's something that governments have been keen to encourage. So I just want to challenge the idea that this is something that universities have done on their own. It's served the interests of governments over many years that the universities do that for a whole range of reasons. The second is the idea that we've somehow been reckless in not monitoring the risks associated with this. I think universities have been very careful in monitoring the risks. The problem is that no one foresaw this risk. In my university, for example, we have a risk management committee, which is a subcommittee of our governing body, our council. And let me tell you, they take the question of risk assessment, risk appetite, risk management extremely seriously. And of course, we did foresee and plan for eventualities such as the deterioration in diplomatic relationships with China and the potential that there would be a significant downturn in students coming from China to study in Australia. In the case of my university, for example, we've been very cautious about the number of Chinese students we enroll for that reason. The problem is that the COVID pandemic, no one expected it. It's like, you know, the Monty Python Spanish Inquisition. No one expected it. And that, when that happens, that throws out all of your risk mitigation, your careful risk management frameworks and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a bit like accusing Qantas of being too reliant on air travel. You know, shouldn't they have foreseen that air travel was going to disappear for a period of time? So I think I just want to take issue with those two statements. I mean, you're right. The impact of this, however, is going to be absolutely profound. And I think it will cause everyone to take stock of how universities are funded, and whether that reliance on international student revenue is sustainable. Clearly, it's not. The government now has a big problem in that the things that we used to fund out of international student revenue either no longer happen, and they're things like research, infrastructure, IT systems, upgrading buildings, and so on. Government pays us nothing for that. So now that the international student revenue has gone, who's going to pick up the cost of that? And that's a big challenge, not just for the university sector, but for government as well, because universities contribute over half of the nation's research effort and research innovation. They're the only sector in the economy that's been increasing their investment in R&D. That capacity to invest is going to be severely damaged. So this is not just an issue facing the university sector. This is a national issue that the government is going to now have to address.
Great, thank you. Let's shift to the financial management aspect of it. Professor Skies, in a very interesting article called Fail You in 2016, refers to what he calls the revenue theory of cost and cautions as follows, and I quote, "Essentially, institutes of higher education are economically unique in that they have no good way of measuring unit cost, and hence can theoretically spend limitless amounts of money in the name of providing an education," end quote. There have been concerns raised regarding what is often referred to as an administrative bloat, or the grossly disproportionate student-staff ratio, due to a failure to leverage the benefits of modern information communication technology. It is also alleged that between 2013 and 2017, the remuneration of key leadership personnel rose by about 74%, and reports that remuneration packages of well over $1 million each are being enjoyed by some in top leadership positions, and in some cases twice as much as the remuneration of the Prime Minister of Australia. Alistair Lee of the consultancy Alum Grow states as follows: "The amount of funding wasted because of the flawed annual budget modeling cycle is mind-boggling." So my question is COVID-19 the scapegoat for a systemic issue that already existed for many years? Was this a disaster waiting to happen?
Look, I don't think so. I mean, Australian universities have been incredibly successful, let's not forget. On pretty much any measure, if you take world rankings of universities, Australia punches way above its weight in terms of the number of universities that are ranked in the top 200 in the world, way above our share of the world's economy. Student satisfaction with their experience at universities has risen steadily over the last 20 years. Measures of productivity of university performance have improved similarly over the last 20 years. I think the Australian taxpayer has had a remarkably good return on its investment in the university system. At the same time, we have produced graduates who supply some key workforces, particularly in areas like health, engineering, medicine, absolutely vital elements of the economy. They depend crucially on the graduates that universities produce. And universities do that according to the standards set down by the professional bodies. So there may be some truth in the fact that universities waste money here and there, or that they're not as ruthlessly efficient as they could be. But if you look at it through the lens of return on investment made and the performance of the sector by international benchmarks, I think the criticism that universities are poorly managed, poorly run, and wasteful is unfair. I mean, COVID challenges a lot of business models, and I mean, universities are very strange beasts. There's no doubt about it. Government funds us for part of what we do, and has used different funding formulae to determine how much it pays us over the years. And there's another body of legislation going through Parliament right now, which will change it yet again. And then when it comes to international students, we have a free market. We can set our own price. And it seems that market forces in the conventional sense don't really operate in the market for fee-paying students, because what students think they're paying is really more the prestige or for the reputation of the institution they're enrolling in than it is for the actual cost or real price, if you can work that out, of the good they're purchasing. So there are a lot of aspects of the way universities operate that are not really susceptible to the law of the market or the law of economics. And it does mean that they're peculiar places. They're a mixture of public sector and ruthless private sector. But what I can say is that I think this areas of efficiency, of digital transformation, and scrutiny of university finances have all improved in recent years. Universities are highly regulated. You know, here in Victoria, we're accountable not just to the federal government for how we spend our money, but to the state government as well. And any financial issues that a university has are very quickly exposed in the public domain. And our governing bodies, our councils, are packed with real experts in accounting, business finance, IT, and you know, there's a whole community of really distinguished and very skilled people who contribute a lot of their time to advising people like me and to holding university management to account. And we benefit hugely from that expertise. So I think these criticisms are a bit unfair. I wouldn't say that they were completely inaccurate, but I think universities are better run and better financially managed than people often give them credit for, particularly given the environment in which we operate, which, as I said, is a bit irrational. You know, it's as I say, partly government bureaucracy and partly ruthless privateering. But it's that's one reason why I love working in this sector, Suresh. It's endlessly fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this pandemic has challenged many organizations' business models. It will challenge ours, but you know, I think we will come out of this stronger as a result.
Great, thank you. My next question is around something that's very close to me personally, the core purpose of higher education. I'm a product of the University of Hard Knocks and enrolled at a traditional university for the very first time, long after I had become a CEO. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a traditional university entrant, if you like. So let me go back in time. There was a recent study in the Australian that recalled that former Federal Minister of Education, John Dawkins, has himself expressed disillusionment that his Dawkins revolution of the late 1980s was clearly misunderstood and led to what he calls, in his words, uniformity, not innovation or diversity. And the mistaken belief that universities must focus on research rather than a teaching first approach. It was not mandated but an unfortunate outcome of autonomy. There have also been allegations that universities tend to recruit students into courses that deliver higher profits than those that produce skills that students want or society needs. More recently, Professor Stephen Parker, former Vice Chancellor of ANU, has pointed out, and I quote, "Universities were seen to be drifting towards the research first rather than a teaching first model." And that the Federal Minister of Education, Dan Tehan's recent reforms of a fee structure based on teaching costs without the recognition of research costs is a de facto separation of the two elements. The 900 million fund that was allocated for research is matched with skills that the industry needs. And within that, there is a hidden message that the focus should be on applied research as opposed to pure research. The job-ready graduate reform agenda clearly reiterates the federal government's priority. Win Massaro of the University of Melbourne and formerly of the Vice Chancellor's Committee states as follows: "We need a new definition of the university that allows each to determine the mix of teaching and research. However, they must all be teaching institutions with a graduate outcome that can be measured." There's a rather worrying study done by 3 Chinese researchers based in the UK, which was fairly recent, and they concluded that the biggest concern for Chinese students was that, and I quote, "there was an imbalance between the high cost of studying in Australia and the low quality of teaching and learning." So my question is, are we neglecting the fundamental questions of what are we teaching, why, and for whom? Are universities obsessed with QS and other international ratings on which basis research funding hinges? And hence, are they placing an over-reliance on pure research? Has the core purpose of educating and helping Australians to get jobs lost its primacy? And have our universities ceased to be excellent teaching institutions offering graduate outcomes that can be measured?
Wow, that's a very big question, sir, or a series of questions. Let me try and answer them as best I can. Firstly, on the question of uniformity, I absolutely agree. I think the Australian higher education sector is incredibly uniform, especially if you compare it with perhaps the example at the other extreme end of the spectrum, which is the United States, which is incredibly diverse. And there are a whole range of reasons why that's the case there and why uniformity is the case here. I agree with Vin Massaro. I think we do need a system in which universities are encouraged to play to their strengths, whether that be in teaching or research. And at the moment, we don't really have a system that encourages that. In the end, the big player in this is government. Government is our primary funder and will be now for the foreseeable future. They set the ground rules, they set the incentives by and large, not exclusively, but by and large. And I don't know of any education minister that has really taken seriously the question, how do we promote diversity and playing to strength in a system that currently looks very uniform? I mean, just to put a number on that issue of diversity versus uniformity, in the United States, about 26% of their universities would qualify as PhD awarding universities. The other 75% will be a huge array of universities. Some will be undergraduate only liberal arts colleges. Some will be undergraduate and masters only colleges. Some will be specialist in terms of their disciplinary fields, a huge array. And yet You contrast that figure of 26% of PhD granting universities in the US with the figure in Australia, which is 100%. We're all the same. We all try and do the same. We're all pretending that we're Melbourne, Sydney, or Monash. And in a way, it's not surprising because the prize has been set to be like that, you know. And the more the sector has been essentially forced to rely on international student revenue, the more it forces the sector into that model of pursuing the international rankings so that you can attract the international students. And the international students then provide you with the resource to improve your performance in the international rankings. And so it goes on. You become a bit like a hamster in a wheel. And while that's had enormous benefits, as I said before, to Australia and to the sector, it's brought, you know, great resource in that wouldn't otherwise have been there, and it's brought great assets to the nation. It is nevertheless true that we have a very uniform system. Now, I would love to have a system in which the minister or the department sat down with each university and said, what are you really good at? What do you want to be known for? I know what the answer would be in the case of my institution, and I can say more about that later on, because we're now going through a process of asking ourselves, what are our strengths? Because part of our strategy for recovery from the COVID pandemic is necessarily going to be really focusing on the things that we do really well. But the funding regime in which we operate does not actually favor that particularly, but we decided to go with it anyway. Now, the other part of your question, so I agree with those comments, Suresh, absolutely agree. I think the sector has become far too uniform, and the rewards and incentives are all incentivizing and rewarding the same things, and not rewarding diversity or playing to strength. On the question of have universities abandoned the teaching mission, absolutely not. We teach more students now than we've ever, well, up until the end of last year, universities taught more students than ever before. In fact, since the introduction of the demand-driven system, effectively around about 2010, 2011, the sector has grown both domestically and internationally by the equivalent of 3 universities the size of Monash University. So that's a huge growth in the sector. So I don't think it's fair to say that universities have been neglecting their teaching mission at all. And as I said before, I think the external measures we have of student satisfaction have actually improved over that time as the sector has grown. So now, obviously, it's not uniformly brilliant. There are going to be pockets of poor performance where there's evidence of, you know, poor or bad practice. But there are now mechanisms within the sector that were not there when I was a student, I can tell you, to monitor performance, to identify poor performance and underperformance, and to make sure you have processes in place to remedy it. So, you know, we have our own regulator, and they decide whether we get to be reaccredited as a university, and one of the criteria for that accreditation is that we have good quality assurance systems in place, so that you're monitoring your performance, you're identifying where you're falling short, and then you're doing something about it. So no, I'm not going to pretend that every student has a brilliant experience at university, but I think there is now much more attention to the quality of that experience, to the quality of the teaching. Academic staff are held much more to account for the quality of what they do in the classroom. And as I say, universities are teaching on a scale that has been until this year, completely unheard of. You know, we now have a mass higher education system. Just after the Second World War, approximately 1% of the adult 18 to 25 population was able to go to university. That figure now is almost 40%. That is a profound transformation in the sector and in the life chances of the young people who've been able to come into those universities. And that's been because governments understand that successful economies require tertiary educated young people. And all of the forecasts about employment growth and where economic growth is going to happen in the economy bear that out, that it's the level one skills that are going to be most in demand, and they're the ones that universities produce. And I don't think it's true to say that universities have ignored where the needs in the economy are and have just pursued profit. I mean, when we had the demand-driven system between basically 2011 and 2017, the disciplines that grew fastest were the disciplines where there was the greatest employment need. Disciplines like STEM and health. Those disciplines grew much quicker than arts, humanities, law, and business, which is where you might think if you were pursuing profit, you'd pay most of your attention. So I think these criticisms are unfair. Obviously, it's not uniformly good practice. Sometimes universities do the wrong thing, or individual members of staff do the wrong thing. But I don't think we should treat those, I think, isolated examples as evidence of the performance of the whole. I think the evidence around the performance of the whole is actually very positive. And as I said before, I think the Australian taxpayer gets a remarkable return on the investment he and she make in the Australian university sector.